Okay, well, I think now it's 3 minutes after, so I think we will start. Welcome, everyone, to the fourth webinar in the Group of 78 six-session series of webinars on the future of UN peacekeeping in the transition to a more peaceful world, why UN peace operations are critical and need to be expanded. My name is Peggy Mason, co-chair of the Group of 78 Webinar Planning Committee and president of the Rideau Institute, a co-sponsor of this event. On 24 December, we had our keynote launch with former head of UN peacekeeping, Jean-Marie Guéhenno, who noted that in spite of growing Security Council fragmentation, UN peacekeeping mandates are being renewed and more European countries are beginning to re-engage in them. On September 26th, panel 1 looked at successes and failures and lessons learned. And Professor Lise Howard reviewed the robust statistical evidence that UN peacekeeping works far more often than it fails. Richard Gowan highlighted the challenge posed to UN missions like those in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Sudan by the sidelining of the UN conflict resolution role by regional actors with their own agendas. That too harkened back to an admonition by Ambassador Guéhenno about the primacy of politics, that is, of finding political solutions to the fundamentally political problems underlying these conflicts, and the consequent need for UN peace operations to re-establish their preeminent role in facilitating conflict resolution by the parties. On 28 September, panel 2, entitled Controversies, Impartiality, Consent, Use of Force, examined what UN peacekeeping operations should or should not do, particularly in relation to the use of force, as well as assessing UN peacekeeping partnerships in Africa. Professor Jane Bolden focused on the tension between the core UN peacekeeping principles of consent of the parties, impartiality, and limited use of force on the one hand, and stabilization mandates requiring sometimes robust use of force on the side of the government of the host nation on the other. Professor Paul Williams highlighted the chaotic array of partnerships the UN is facing in Africa, with hybrid UN African Union missions and various other lesser types of support and pressures, growing pressures, I might say, for financial assistance, for UN financial assistance for this array of different missions. All of these sessions are now available on YouTube, on the Group of 78 YouTube site. And I don't know, Sarah, if you've got the link there, or if you don't, you will at some point put up the link for folks. But you can just Google Group of 78 YouTube.
I just posted it in the comments.
Sarah has posted the link for everyone. This brings me to today's panel 3 on the future of UN peace operations, where our panelists will consider how the UN can rebuild a strong consensus on the core elements of peacekeeping, particularly the primacy of politics over operational or tactical issues, and will revisit the UN Emergency Peace Service. Following presentations by each of our 2 panelists, whom I will have the pleasure of introducing shortly, we will take up the questions that participants, that you, our audience, can pose by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And you have to touch the bottom of your screen for it to appear, and typing in your question. You can do this while the presentations are being delivered, as well as during the question time itself. You can also click the like button for questions other than your own, and this will move them up the list. Although I have to say I rankle at that one, because I think people who are brave enough to ask their questions early should get priority. But anyway, there is that right you have of voting something up. And hopefully I will keep track of questions that have been answered so that they will go into the answered category. And I'm looking for help from our Executive Secretary, Sarah Bowles, in that regard. And now for the introductions. Victoria K. Holt, Tory Holt, is a vice president of the Washington-based Henry L. Stimson Center, a progressive think tank promoting international security, shared prosperity, and justice through applied research, innovation, and engagement. And since February 2020, is a part of its senior leadership team. She is also an adjunct professor in international and public affairs at Columbia University. Her expertise focus on issues relating to international security and multilateral tools, including peace operations and conflict prevention, the United Nations and the Security Council, protection of civilians, crisis regions, and US policy making. Prior to joining Stimson, Holt was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Security in the Bureau of International Organization Affairs at the US Department of State, serving from 2009 to early 2017. In that role, she was responsible for US policy and guidance, for US actions in the UN Security Council, and for its mechanisms. She oversaw the Office of Peace Operations, Sanctions and Counterterrorism, and the Office of United Nations Political Affairs. She led the development of US diplomatic initiatives, including the 2015 Leaders Summit on UN Peacekeeping, hosted by President Obama to increase capacities for UN operations. And I'm sure I speak for our other panelists and myself in saying that we hope that the spirit that informed that effort by President Obama finds a new home in January in the United States. Turning next to our second panelist, Peter Langille, a senior advisor of the Rideau Institute and a member of the planning committee for this series of webinars. Peter Langille specializes in peace and conflict studies, United Nations peace operations, conflict resolution and mediation, and independent analysis of defense and security policy. He earned his PhD in peace studies under Paul Rogers at Bradford University in the UK, names which will be very familiar to many of the Canadians listening here today. Peter Langille was one of the key players behind the establishment in 1994-95 of the Pearson International Peacekeeping Training Center, a multidimensional, civilian-run UN peace operations training center, unique and ahead of its time, but allowed to wither and die for lack of governmental support in 2013. Peter Langille has also been instrumental in the development of concrete measures to address one of the most stubborn and to date unresolved challenges of UN peacekeeping operations, the timely deployment of the mission. Far too often it's not a timely deployment, it's an untimely deployment. He was a key contributor to Canada's 1995 study towards a rapid reaction capability for the United Nations. In a 2002 book, he developed the initial concept of a permanent UN emergency peace service and further refined it in his 2015 book, Developing a United Nations Emergency Peace Service, Meeting Our Responsibilities to Prevent and Protect. Along the way, and despite the boldness of his vision, he has garnered many supporters, including our keynote speaker, former head of UN Peacekeeping, Jean-Marie Guéhenno. I think you will agree that we have two very exciting speakers to address us this afternoon and then to field questions on the future of UN peace operations. Let me turn first to Tori Holt, who, among other things, will discuss how a new consensus on the core principles or fundamentals of UN peacekeeping might develop, the role of specialized peacekeeping training, and on the sustaining peace front, how UN peacekeeping might begin to contribute much more directly to helping the UN achieve its sustainable development goal of access to sustainable energy. Tori Holt, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation today. It's a pleasure to be here and joining you from Washington. I think there's a huge role to be played by institutes such as your own and also for civil society in your group of 78. And sometimes when crises seem greatest is exactly the time to think about the future. So thank you again. Obviously, peacekeeping, peace operations are an enduring tool. They're deeply flexible, but they're not flexible to handle everything. And so thinking about what that can look like, I think is critical. But to have this conversation, I can't help but look slightly backwards for a moment to in part recognize what problems have already been solved. And then I will turn to some of the issues you just mentioned, including sort of UN architecture, how to realign the primacy of politics, and maybe how to think afresh about where peace operations go. And also maybe to echo something that Jean-Marie Gaheno and Richard Gowan and others said, if you look at the dynamics on the Security Council, you still see a high level of voting and consensus that peace operations should continue. There will always be debated and argued over, but that is an incredibly enduring tool of the UN and of the international community. And so I say that with great appreciation. So my short tour backwards includes recognizing what we have addressed. So after the end of the Cold War, we quickly realized that peace operations, peacekeeping missions could not just monitor ceasefires. They had to be multidimensional. And I saw this firsthand when I went to Haiti in the mid-90s, and a Canadian peacekeeper swerved off of the official road in the city Soleil to drive me through the slums and show me what the people were dealing with there. I later met with Canadian police officers, not just in Haiti, but in Eastern Congo, who took me into remote villages where sexual violence had really affected the communities and was part of an effort to get local police and local communities to speak up and protect their own civilians from that kind of extreme violence. Canada's role in recognizing coming out of Rwanda and on a sustained basis the need to protect civilians has been path-breaking and enduring. And today we see a UN that is transformed by this goal. And if while not always able to deliver on it, you can't find a single UN mission that is not aware of civilian vulnerability and their role in trying to address the protection of civilians, something you could not have said even 10 years ago. I won't skip over everything, but I think that the role that Canada's played in developing the Women, Peace and Security agenda, most recently with the ELSI initiative, recognizing the role of child soldiers and what Dallaire has led on, among others, and your government's commitment over many years to peacekeeping training, core capacities, what we saw in Vancouver in 2017, which led off of the summit that Vice President Biden launched in 2014, President Obama launched in 2015, and Canada picked up to marry up capacities with mandates so it could be implemented in the field. So I just want to recognize that in the past, what we've learned is that when you see problems, a group of committed individuals, academics, researchers, and government people, as well as citizens themselves in these fragile states, can work together to come up with creative solutions to implement. So in that spirit, it looks pretty dire right now. We've got an expansion of conflict, the greatest level of displacement since World War II, with IDPs, refugees, and migration. We have a growth of non-state actors and proxy wars, and an internationalization of a lot of civilian conflicts. Many times humanitarian crises are now twinned with these conflicts, including the rise of authoritarianism, abuse of international humanitarian human rights law in the field by armed actors, and it seems a disregard for democracy. But that's even without mentioning climate change, the pandemic, and the lack of leadership from classic allies. So, what are the things I would flag and then a way forward? Nonetheless, peace operations endure. However, I think there's at least a few things we need to be mindful of. First of all, the flexibility of peace operations, multidimensional, looking at protection of civilians, deploying civilians, police, and military, cannot become a warfighting force on its own. So one thing I would like to start by flagging is the shift to have peace operations use force, have Chapter 7 authority to do so, is on behalf of their mandate to protect themselves and to protect civilians and be a temporary security measure. But in places like Mali and in the Sahel overall, or if you can see Somalia, the UN itself cannot be a full-time combat operation, and nor should we ask it to be. It can play a role in trying to prevent extremism through countering and preventing violent extremism, often a civilian strategy, but they're not a counterterrorism force. And trying to shift them into that posture will do harm to some of the very benefits that you get from a peace operation, which comes in with the consent of the nation, with impartiality, and with the backing of the Security Council to support a political process. I don't have an easy answer. Peter may address some of this in his remarks, but there needs to be a division of labor between a civilian-led peace operation, which has a long-term strategy for stabilizing, protecting, and helping the political leadership take over, and that of a war-fighting mission, which may need to handle extremists or those who refuse to stand down from a conflict. In the 90s, we called these multinational force missions, and you saw that division of labor in the Balkans when UNPROFOR could not successfully stop the conflict. You saw this in Sierra Leone when the British briefly went in and then handed back to a UN mission. And you see that a bit today in Somalia, where the African Union leads an African Union mission. It's mandated to go after al-Shabaab, and the UN leads a political mission to provide support for governance and long-term development humanitarian relief. So we can do this, but I worry a little that some of this has become a little blurry, particularly in the cases of Mali and Sahel. Second is the primacy of peace processes. As I mentioned, as actually the ambassador mentioned, we've just finished a study with UN University and the Stimson Center looking at the primacy of politics. The report is called The Political Practice of Peacekeeping. And we took from it what the high-level panel, the HIPPO panel had talked about, was recentering peace operations on political solutions. So let me briefly touch on a few of these, and I'd be happy to share the report and or get into more detail. It was primarily looking at the big 5 peace operations, peacekeeping missions today in Darfur, South Sudan, CAR, Mali, and Congo. And we found that overall, there was not a clear definition of what political strategies look like. Some SRSGs would even say it's in their head. Some missions felt very clear about how the civilian, police, and military components lined up, others not so much. So first of all, we would argue that strategy should come first and mandates should come second. And the HIPPO had recommended a 2-stage process where a small team go out and scope out the politics, and that leads to the mandate. That seems like common sense, but that would be a good start. Political solutions also are really the basis for successful peace operations. But peace agreements should not be mistaken as the political solution. In some cases, they don't exist. And in places, one could argue, in Mali, there was one that was signed, but it was really local efforts that are needed to build back to a political consensus and understand what's happening at the local level. In other places, the peace agreement can almost be a distraction from the political solution. One could point to Darfur, for example. And then another related problem is even a successful peace agreement may not stop the violence and the killing. So that's a lot to hold in one's head, but political solutions are more expansive than peace agreements, even as peace agreements are critical. So what do we do about this? Better analytic tools and understanding the local dynamics that may not be immediately obvious. Help the nations themselves understand how to link up both bilateral, local, regional, and international efforts. Understand that the population often wants a peace dividend. And what does that look like? So that's a very quick summary of that point. We have a lot more in our report. And then finally, 2 quick things. The protection of civilians and political strategies actually go hand in hand. We need more research on this. As we've seen the Security Council prioritize protection of civilians, for some that's an interpretation that is more important than a political solution. And actually, we would argue they go together. Civilians are being harmed, your political strategy is probably not working. If you know the perpetrators, you've got a better roadmap to who needs to be part of the political solution or fully sidelined. So they're deeply connected, and that's an area of future research for us. So those are a few things. Just the last comment, which I'll come to back at the end, is that bilateral, multilateral need to be lined up. Governments like Canada, the United States, we often have a very strong team that does multilat, but it's also important that our embassies and those on the front lines in fragile states are linked up, and there's a good dialogue between the two. So another area to look at is, and maybe this is a bit more forward-looking, is how much the UN peace operations, looking at local peace building, looking at how to integrate with states that are deeply fragile, could recognize the UN's own commitments through the SDGs, as well as the commitments on climate. Let me give you an example. A lot of UN operations operate in very austere environments. And there's a quite powerful Department of Support Energy and Environment Strategy, which asks missions to be thoughtful about reducing their footprint, reducing use, and in the case of energy, also thinking about use of renewables. How could you better, in a place like Mali, actually reduce the supply chain requirements in the convoys by maybe adopting more use of renewable energy? If you didn't have to truck diesel all over the country, you might be able to have a sustainable answer. And if so, does it make sense then to work locally with communities that need access to energy and leverage the UN's investment in the money it brings in to build its own infrastructure and support its own personnel to work with local communities to support their building of capacity for local communities. This may fit with the climate goals of host nations. This may fit with the energy strategies of host nations. It should not ever be the primary goal of a peace operation, but it could be a secondary or third order effect, which could help with peace building long run. So we're doing some research into this and have done some case studies if anyone's interested in how to harmonize both the UN's own goals in these areas, fragility and peace building long run. So I've gone from tough to a little bit more optimistic. I think some enduring recommendations going forward include you have to match mandates and capacity. And Peggy, you mentioned training. I think that's both at kind of a core level and a pre-deployment level. Every mission is different, and understanding that environment is very important. I know in the case where the US would send in personnel, we often, I wished always for more time. That the officers we had, fabulous as they were often coming out of Iraq or Afghanistan or the Balkans, and the UN was like sending them to a foreign planet. So I would argue that we could do much better at both situational awareness, long-term training, and then reward for them. Our military, and we're not the only one, doesn't necessarily reward officers who serve in these missions for leadership, even though they are probably better able to do that from that experience. Capacity is also enablers, and that's what that summit process has gone on to try and harvest and make available to the UN. So the UN can be incredibly picky. It says we need engineers who can do X, Y, Z. They should have that available, and I think that's still a work in progress. Obviously, a few other things, and I'm sitting in Washington. Governments need to pay their dues on time and in full, and a number of governments have picked up the habit of paying late, not in full, and with conditions. I think that's a policy that needs reversal. And for governments who do pay in time and on full, they should remind the ones who aren't of how important it is. That rarely is a message conveyed in bilateral channels. The UN itself has its own roadmap, the A4P. I won't repeat it all. But what the benefit of it is that many member states have signed up for it. The UN has signed up for it, and it's an enlivened project. It doesn't just say do 3 things. It ranges across military, police, civilian, political, protection of civilians, up to and inclusive of strategic communications. So I think taking that and really implementing it could go a long way in supporting what would be future operations. Do we know what the future looks like? No. Can I give you a list of the missions we'll see in the future? No. Has the UN suggested before that peace operations are over? Some could say we haven't had one, rightly so, for many years. But we said the same in the mid-90s. Peacekeeping was declared dead. It was down to 12,000 troops. Everyone thought NATO and regional forces were the future. And then suddenly, a few years later, we had the largest increase in peacekeeping missions in its history by the 2000s. So it's hard to predict, but you can see the conflicts around the world where you could imagine observers could play a critical role in going back in and reminding the parties to put down their guns. You can see complex operations where a peace agreement is met, and you might need the UN to come in and support that peace agreement. And you can see other areas where you have a mix of humanitarian crises and parties who are willing to implement agreements to go forward but need the support of a UN authorized or UN-led mission. None of this is to say that the African Union regional organizations mediation is not critical. They are all also important. So while it's unpredictable, I think peace operations are an enduring tool. They need support. They also need modernization reform on a constant basis. And while I could sit and criticize, I'll also have to congratulate the UN on being open to that criticism and modernization. So we in civil society, those of us in government, need to constantly push for change. So thank you for inviting me to this conversation. Those are a few ideas that may kick off a conversation. I see Peter may have stepped out. I'm sorry if I ended early.
Okay, well, yes. Thank you. Thank you very, very much for that. Yes, a lot of ideas and two very exciting studies looking at the big question, the primacy of politics question on the one hand, but then looking very specifically at how to meet one of the very, very important SDGs on access to energy and on at the local level, and how the UN mission might play a role to that effect. So, and also thank you very much for your comments. Of course, you're coming from a think tank, but also for civil society, for making that comment about civil society and the role that civil society can play in helping forge solutions, but also sometimes in thinking big when governments, of course, are so in the weeds of the issues of the day. And so on the thinking big, that leads me to our next speaker, Peter Langille, who's going to talk about the United Nations Emergency Peace Service. Peter, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Peggy, and thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you for all the heavy lifting to pull this wonderful event together. I'm here mostly to introduce the proposed United Nations Emergency Peace Service. As a prelude, I'll give you my sense of why this matters now, and then briefly review the basic plan, a UNEPS introduction. With respect to the future of peace operations, I think we're in a brief calm before the storm. Most here are seeing a push for more intense confrontation with more preparation for war, just when we really can't afford it and desperately need those resources elsewhere. We all see our global challenges becoming emergencies, new extremes of nationalism and intolerance, more desperation and misery spreading, a perception that some governments aren't working and leadership to confirm it. Like any accumulated energy, climate change will soon be coming faster and more furious. And combined, even that short list may almost appear as a perfect storm for more armed conflict. Is the UN prepared for further turbulence? No, not from where I sit. We'd all agree that UN peace operations are critical, a smart investment, worthy of support, far more support. But operations are already facing tight limits with further cuts. Mission budgets are so tight, it can be difficult to even afford deploying standing police officers into an operation. 2 operations in fragile conflicts are being downsized to impotent, leaving millions of rather vulnerable civilians. Now, almost everyone in the 90s also heard that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We heard that from the UN, so got excited. The one occasion when we saw a preventive deployment tried was back in '95 with Dept, which worked surprisingly well to stem what might have been a wider war. Yet nothing resembling that inspiring prevention was even retried. And instead, we saw a bit of a fallback, in my mind, to post-conflict stabilization operations, which often means waiting for most of the real fighting to cease, then moving in afterward with larger, longer, costlier operations. To my mind, the earlier emphasis on prevention and a fast response to stem armed conflict, that had a lot more potential to work, not simply just to save lives, however crucial that is, save lives and costs, but also to inspire governments and people. And that mattered. Unfortunately, it hasn't been retried or tried since. Yes, Tori's correct. You likely haven't noticed that the UN, or you likely have noticed the UN hasn't launched a new peace operation in 6 years. Perhaps at the moment because it can't. But what do we hear now? We hear calls to recalibrate expectations to assume less, calls for smaller political missions, calls for more partnerships, or recently a call to revise the now dead UN standby arrangement system that never really worked. To me, that's more incremental tinkering. It doesn't inspire me. It appears defeatist, almost like we're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Although I'd grant we're not, thankfully. As Tori also noted, none of us know the politics of the future. But I doubt it's going to be any easier for the UN if we don't insist on an organization that can fulfill assigned tasks, and one that might still save succeeding generations. So I don't want to jeopardize the future by dropping that vision and simply lowballing for credibility and access. I fear that sticking with incremental reforms, what I'd call the tippy-toe approach, won't be sufficient for what's ahead. It hasn't delivered promptly in the past, and it hasn't delivered all that much in the past. It's largely been a P5 stipulation since '95. So where are we at? To paraphrase a line from Bernie Sanders, the UN still gets the harsh austerity and limited means, while NATO's national militaries, who don't perform all that much better and cost tenfold, get the guaranteed socialized support. Why? Well, as Lise Howard noted the other day, the UN doesn't have a natural or obvious constituency. If the UN can't inspire and raise expectations, it risks being seen as less than adequate. And sadly, that perception has spread and traveled here, despite what we've already seen over the past 2 weeks, a heap of evidence to the contrary. Now, to attract a constituency, it's not rocket science. We really simply have to offer appealing solutions. If an idea has the potential to solve a few problems, it might attract wider support. In short, my point here, as you know, is that we do need big ideas with viable plans to motivate people and mobilize governments to actually aim higher for a more effective UN. And I'm going to share one idea. Here, we almost all appreciate our emergency services, knowing that we can get help fast by just dialing 911, or if you're European, 999. Elsewhere, it's not so easy, but it's really not that hard to imagine what might work. As I see it, the world needs a UN 911 first responder too. And I need your patience with help to move a PowerPoint up on the screen, which it can be challenging without teenagers. So still there? Thank you. Okay, a United Nations Emergency Peace Service. 4 long-standing challenges drove this development and influenced the design of UNEPS. It really began as a cooperative endeavor within 3 national studies and a multinational initiative that included a lot of senior UN officials and professionals in peace operations. It's designed to address the following 4 big hurdles. As you heard, since the 90s, there's been a lot of talk about preventing conflicts, but very little progress in that direction. Similarly, we've heard a lot about protecting civilians, especially after R2P, but I don't think there's been sufficient progress in operationalizing protection. I know Tori and colleagues did brilliant work on protection earlier, yet many national militaries are reluctant to play that role. Third, rapid deployment has been a UN priority for 30 years, although it may still take 6 to 12 months or more to deploy. And that current approach will remain very slow. Fourth, people are experiencing more emergencies, and the UN's capacity to respond is effectively stretched thin. In complex crises, we should know it can be very difficult to address human needs. So here's an idea that might help. The essence of the idea is to provide timely help. Providing timely help is likely to require a standing permanent first responder service. And to correspond to contemporary and future requirements, a UNEPS has to be multidimensional with civilians, police, and military elements. To be cost effective, it has to be multifunctional, capable of providing sophisticated responses to diverse crises. Yes, this service will have to be very busy. It'll have to be widely valued, seen as worthwhile to avoid being axed under budget pressures. And as this will be a new service, the UN could ensure it's gender equitable and draws on recruited volunteers from all regions of the world. We know increasing the role of women in peace operations works and improves on peace building, conflict resolution, mediation, much more. National militaries likely know this, but most remain quite slow to help with gender equity. So I think a UNEPS could be a big boost to raising standards system-wide. Finding the right people here is probably doable. Another objective is to develop more legitimate, sophisticated, dedicated service, one whose strings can't be pulled by every participating reluctant government. Fine. I think I said this, didn't I? No, I'm not sure. Okay, the process for recruitment of volunteers, well, that should be relatively familiar to the UN Secretariat and among UN guards. The UN simply advertises and recruits from the best, brightest, and most dedicated people available from around the world. Then screens, selects on the basis of merit, skill, and professionalism. Those who succeed are employed and then trained extensively. How would this operate, or what would the structure look like? UNEPS would have to have an operational headquarters at a designated base, ideally with 2 mobile mission headquarters, with similar deployable elements under each. Now you're looking at the outline of the proposed operational headquarters, with the offices needed to direct, train, move, deploy, and support. Perhaps more interesting to a military community. If we shift to see the deployable elements, you'll see a relatively robust brigade group on the left side of your screen, with reconnaissance, infantry, aviation, logistics, mobile hospital. On the right side are the police and civilian services, including teams for human rights, conflict resolution and mediation, disaster assistance, peace building, quick impact project teams, environmental crisis response teams, medical teams. That's just an idea of what this should look like, ideally. Thank you. Why this model for a UNEPS? Well, it offers several useful services with incentives for cooperation and disincentives to deter and stop violence. Yes, it has to complement existing UN arrangements. It can by deploying rapidly for up to 6 months until the problem's resolved or until governments are ready to offer multinational contingents. A first responder, possibly a stopgap. This is where the hurdle comes in. The startup or development fee of 3.5 billion may appear huge in the UN context, but it's likely to be shared among 194 member states. When put in the context of global military spending that actually really seldom prevents, a UNEPS costs a fraction. Our Canadian government's planning to build 15 Navy frigates at a cost of $4.6 billion each. The total $70 billion. UNEPS at $3 billion, $3.5 billion. Doesn't seem like that bad a deal. If this service actually helped to reduce one of the 5 on your list, it should be a very cost-effective, smart investment. I don't think there's any doubt we'd reduce the number of armed conflicts, size, duration, and number of peace operations, pressure on national governments. If you look at the final on the list, the Global Peace Index reporting cost of war and armed conflicts already over 14 trillion. That's staggering. So not a bad investment to look at small, that's relatively inexpensive. As early as 1961, the US State Department saw the potential to reduce national armaments, rely on a UN peace force. In that light, UNEPS might be considered a vital aspect of peace disarmament and global governance efforts. This encouraging assessment from Cuenca, it may demonstrate the potential to move the idea wider and up. That arose from very diverse representatives of all sectors. But it's probably the case that equally important to the wider appeal is the prospect of it being far tougher for politicians to oppose legitimate emergency services for others. These are simply what we look at in terms of what's necessary to move this idea. Clearly, there's a lot to do if you may have spare time or need a place to invest. Sorry, it's almost funny. Yes, this is just one step in an overdue process, but we know that there's vast potential in the idea. Whether it'll be realized, I don't know. One final point, a key lesson of previous experience is that favorable conditions for such a development, these tend to arise in the aftermath of tragic wars or genocides. Yet, previously, when the urgent need was evident, the prior preparation of a viable plan and a core constituency of support was not. So this effort endeavors to ensure both are ready and sufficiently compelling to encourage development of a UN emergency peace service before those emergencies overwhelm. Many thanks all.
Thank you very much, Peter, for an impassioned presentation, and a lot from both presenters to think about. I might have some questions myself, but we've had some up on the screen, and I think I'm going to go there first. Just the very first one, I think Tori is directed to you, and that is asking for the links to be posted if available. I think probably the simplest thing for you to do is to send them. If you send them to me, then we will make sure that everyone gets those links for those very, very interesting studies. And that question from Brian Gifford. And the next question is from Sylvie Lemieux, and she says, thank you for these superior presentations. In the spirit of the supremacy of peace, what do you think of the principle that participative UN nations would agree on negotiators with peace-based interpersonal skills, academia, and field experiences instead of political appointees or diplomats? You've been on many sides of these questions, Tori, so perhaps I'll turn to you on that, and Peter can add if he wants to.
No, absolutely. I think knowledge and experience always help somebody who's trying to craft a peace agreement. We've seen some good trends. I think that the now named Department of Political and Peace Building Affairs, DPPA, formerly Department DPA, has a whole unit, and they try and exactly have people who are expert locally, regionally, as mediators on call. I'm sure they could always use more money and support to do that. They need resources. I think some governments, the United States, pick someone like me to work in the government. So I can't argue I have all those skills, but there is sometimes a good flow between the non-governmental and the governmental, and it's something to be made use of. The only thing I will say in defense of diplomats is that many times they may not know all the details, but if they don't have access to people who do, they can be very good at thinking about how to speak one-on-one with other government leaders. And that's actually a really important skill as well, because there can be motivations that are not directly related to the cause of peace that can close the deal sometimes. So it's a great suggestion, and I'm glad she's put that up.
Peter, did you want to add anything, or we go to the next question? Okay. Okay.
Well, there was one brilliant example, and Tori alluded to it, the amazing work done by the Norwegians to push and prompt that mediation unit, brought in a wonderful new innovative development that's showing the amazing dividends. Yes, obviously people with experience and a background in more than simply business is probably rather crucial in determining what's. We've seen that in the last 3 years, that sometimes the worst of political appointments are made. So I'm all for adding a little bit of credibility to those negotiating peace deals. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. I think I feel compelled to say that what one wants to criticize is unqualified political appointees and diplomats, because I think we won't be arguing against them if they have the kind of qualifications that the mediation unit and the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs is trying to develop. But now I'll turn to the next question. Robin Collins, who happens to be the co-chair of our planning committee, he has raised the question. He says, some have raised the question of stabilization versus other peacekeeping missions. How might a UNEPS better respond to existing options in terms of early availability and resources? So that's clearly a question for you, Peter.
Well, stabilization, by the way it's pursued at the moment, means waiting until the fighting's finished. And then once there's a cease or a ceasefire of sorts, you see a rather slow deployment to trickle in. And sometimes that deployment can take 2 to 3 years to get up to full operational strength mandated by the Security Council. What's distinctly different about a UNEPS is the UN would have its own tool to ensure a rather rapid deployment. So the conflict wouldn't have to escalate and spread, and there wouldn't have to be thousands of hurt people and damaged infrastructure before you actually deployed. You might avert the prospect of wider violence and therefore save enormous costs and lives. I think that's probably the strongest argument, that taking a preventative approach with something that can be deployed immediately by the Security Council just has so many more advantages over post-conflict stabilization. And in many of these operations, while I support them staying there, they are requiring years to resolve deeply seated grievances that won't disappear in decades. And so there's a risk on some operations that are allowed to, where the UN's been late, it has to stay much longer, or there's a risk of a relapse. And I think that, by being early, we avert a lot of the problem and are in a much better position to resolve it diplomatically through a peace process that can be far quicker if you're there early. Thank you.
I think Tori probably wants to get in on this too, but I guess what I want to push back on with respect to the question is I think part of what Robin was alluding to was the discussion we've had about the stabilization mandate that's going on now in missions like Mali and so on. In other words, akin to war fighting. So if the question, would UNEPS, I don't hear from you that UNEPS is meant to take on that kind of war fighting role. But anyway, I think that
it's not a war-fighting mechanism. You're absolutely correct. And it shouldn't have to be, but it should be robust enough to provide a deterrent for the operation and to protect civilians and to manage most of the operational requirements. And yes, it should work well in Chapter 7, but it doesn't really need to be designed for offensive operations beyond what's needed in most current peace operations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now I wonder, Tori, do you want to get in on that or?
Well, maybe just as also a way to comment on Peter's presentation, do not underestimate how hard it is to move quickly, even when the UN Security Council comes together to initiate a new mission or to reinforce one. In South Sudan in 2003, the mission there suddenly found that the president and the vice president had turned on each other and their civil conflict was breaking out. Security Council acted within 5 days. We were part of that. We were very proud that we had authorized additional thousands more troops to come in from other missions so that could accelerate the speed with which they deployed. I don't need to tell you all, it took up to a year for those already deployed peacekeepers to come in. And so, Peter, we could get into details, but the very structure of recruiting, supporting, deploying, and authorizing is archaic for the world we're in, even in regular order. And so in a way, it needs to be a dialogue on almost a very dull topic, which is how does that institutionally work? How do governments understand that system? Because even in my government, which was committed to understanding problems, the average diplomat or even expert does not know anything about how the UN recruits and supports and deploys. So I think you're raising a set of really important issues that get to a core problem of how we match mandates with capacity on a timely, effective basis, not just in emergencies, but in general. And your emergency force, I would hope, would be something that the UN could already do. And there have been initiatives like Sherbrig and other efforts to make speed and capacity quickly deliverable. So I would just say it's an important issue to put on the agenda. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those comments. Now I'm mindful of the questions we've got here. The next question is from Paul. Global solutions seem to be needed here, perhaps awakening to an overarching peace architecture that is not only reactive or preventative to conflict, but of normalizing cultures and institutions of peace. We need to better balance the transactional force solutions with the relational solutions. In all this are the main generational crises we face: climate pandemics, health, and conflict of war, all entangled. Comment. Well, boy, that's a biggie. I think I'll turn back to you, Tori, and then to Peter to make a comment on this. Mindful of the fact that we've got several questions coming as well, but we can go until 5:15, so we should have plenty of time.
Well, look, that is the right ambition. And I'm not sure if Gaheno talked about the interlocking architecture, but he's been a huge advocate of thinking about systems that work together across platforms like the United Nations, the regional organizations, and not walking away from any of them, from local civilian efforts up to the use of force in an appropriate, authorized way. So that's the right ambition. So that we don't get completely lost, I will say I think the World Bank's been doing some innovative work in its fragility, conflict, and violence space. It published Pathways to Peace a few years ago. We hosted at Stimson a briefing from them, and they're trying to say if we care about conflict prevention and fragility and development, then let's start earlier. Let's go to fragile states. Let's recognize the changing dynamics in conflict, but let's accompany all this and not wait until it shows up on the bank's agenda. Now, I'm not a World Bank person. I don't know how it's going, but they were able to work with the UN to try and create on their side a more interactive approach towards long-term conflict prevention and development. And also as part of that, looking at the role of preventing violent extremism. This is all pre-pandemic. We could add 5 more issues to the list. I'm not sure they also took on climate change, but I do think there are people thinking through how to use the tools we have to better adapt across the whole continuum of conflict and peace.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We've got a couple of questions on UNEPS, Peter, so I think I'm going to go to those now. How many new Canadian warships would need to be scrapped to pay for, say, 1/3 of the $3.5 billion cost of the emergency service? The warships are getting all the attention. What about the fighter jets? Then the next one that goes along with that is, UNEPS is a brilliant idea. Where does it stand at this time? Specifically, how is it regarded by the P5? That question from Earl Turcott. And so, Peter, we'll turn to you first. And of course, if Tori has comments she wants to make, then we'll give her the opportunity.
Where does UNEP stand at the moment? The idea is understood by some in progressive political parties and governments. And we've had some actually endorse the idea here recently in the Green Party and the NDP. The British Labour Party was formally inclined. There were 30 members of Congress in the US who put out House Res 213. That was about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. So where is it with respect to the Security Council? I doubt that they really follow it at this level. Obviously, a few progressive parties within might know, but we need to actually push it to get it up, Earl. And that's a process of educational outreach and political networking. I can't say that it's done terribly well in the wider NGO community, although the endorsements are very promising. It regrettably didn't make the short list for UN 75, but that's a process that has to evolve, and it will take time. And who knows where we'll be in a year. I suspect the political environment will be substantively different than where we're at now. Thank you.
There was a specific question on cost, but I guess
yes.
The Canadian warships versus the emergency peace service startup costs.
Well, the UNEP's total cost for startup and development would be approximately $3.5 billion. And we're looking at, as mentioned, a cost in Canada of 1 frigate at $4.6 billion. That's shared by Canadians, but the cost of the UNEPS would likely be shared by governments worldwide. Although it's conceivable that anyone affluent in a network of affluent people could simply say, let's do this and gift it to the UN. Now, that's not an ideal way to do anything, but at the same time, an awful lot seems to be happening that way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm mindful that there are many more questions, but it just I really would like to hear if you have any thoughts, Tori, on the view of the P5, not their specific view now, but what the what the likely impediments would be from the perspective of the P5, I guess, because I think that's worthwhile to know. Not necessarily all of them, but at least some of them, or potential impediments from their perspective.
So do not underestimate how much the job of being a diplomat in New York is different than understanding the logistics in the field of deploying rapid forces, right? And so I think the experience of the Security Council in short order, standing up a new mission in Central African Republic, standing up a new mission in Mali, responding to the crisis in South Sudan, and a little earlier, responding to the fall of Goma and the crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo with a localized intervention force. You had 4 situations in, I think, the space of like roughly 2.5, 3 years. I'd have to check my math. It was a wake-up call that the machinery to support missions that had already been authorized and supported was not sufficient to deploy even where there was full political backing. To me, that was also a sign that the diplomatic service through the diplomatic side of governments was greatly disconnected from the troop police in contributing countries, the force generation and strategic deployment strategy. So this will not satisfy Peter, but it did lead to the summit process. And, the US was looked at as being a little bit vanilla because we are getting heads of states together to talk about the lack of capacity and speed to deploy infra-authorized missions. But I will say, after the summit with President Obama hosted, we had 50,000 more capabilities contributed. We did strengthen the strategic deployment, the rapid deployment levels. We press that governments sign up. We urge the UN to kick out anybody who is not meeting the standards they need and create an architecture of reliance and availability. Obviously, the US leadership shifted early in 2017. I don't think the Trump administration put the same priority on this, but Canadians picked this up in Vancouver in 2017, and countries and others have continued to press. So I remain an optimist that this is a problem in plain sight. And so rather than having to sell it anew, it's a well understood challenge, but it needs leadership. And so I have found from being in government that good leaders need good ideas. I only pretty much find that diplomats want to solve problems. So to the extent that this is an area of renewed interest, I think it's something worth looking at. I don't know if I've fully answered your question. I don't think the P5 necessarily has a strong opinion, but nobody wants to be on a Security Council where what they authorize does not actually happen.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Actually, that's very, very useful perspective on perhaps lesser impediments in some areas than some might have thought, without saying that, and I think in particular the leadership needed. So that's, I wish that was that should be a clarion call to Canada. So, but we've got to get, of course, get Canada fully re-engaged. That's our problem because, Canada going in and telling the UN how it should be doing UN peacekeeping when it's not itself, when there are a lot of others with more recent experience than Canada, notwithstanding our Mali mission, our good little short contribution to Mali. So we've got work to do at home on that. Now I'm going to go back to the questions. We've got the chair of the group of 78, Roy Culpepper, is asking, I would be interested in the views of the panelists on what can be done to arrest the escalating hostilities between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Could the UN play any useful role beyond calls for a ceasefire from the Secretary General and Security Council, which are clearly not having any effect? Would a UNEPS, if it existed, help? Okay. So which one of you wants to tackle that first?
Well, the UN should be able to, but can it? No, because the Security Council would likely veto, I think, a deployment into the area. And UNEP certainly couldn't go anywhere without having authorization from the Security Council. But this is what peacekeeping formally did, set up a tripwire in between belligerent parties that might jeopardize the peace in the middle of a Cold War. And I think a lot more thought has to be given to situations like this. At present, it should be possible to actually damp it down before it blows up. And the UN should have a key role in that. But it's unlikely that the Security Council would authorize, and the Secretary General may still be able to use his good offices to help calm down the hostilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, and I'll turn to Tori in a second. This question is very, very helpful because it reminds us that UN peacekeeping and UNEP, even with UNEPs, cannot solve basic political problems where you have parties, either direct parties to the conflict and or other key players, including the Security Council members, that don't want, are not ready for the UN to play a role. And they can block that from happening. As I understand it, only the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has been allowed near that conflict so far. And they are, far more under-resourced than the UN in this regard and have not been able to make much headway. Tori, did you want to add something there?
Well, I'm certainly no expert on the region and have been listening to the broad news, but the political solutions is what we should remind ourselves of. who's fighting who actually? What's the violence based on? What are the grievances or arguments being made? And who are the parties involved? And I think that is absolutely something that the UN would quietly be doing. I haven't called anyone recently, but this is back to our DPPA point. You've got local experts, you've got mediators. We would not be knowing if they were on the ground, but I would hope they would be. The good offices function is an incredibly valuable part of the UN system, not just from the Secretary General, but throughout. You probably have country teams in the region who might be working on development programs, or UNDP, or UNHCR if there's displacement, who would have a sense of what was going on. So that is all about knowledge and understanding of what's happening at the local and therefore national level. And I would want that to come first anyway. I don't think until you have that little bit of a map, you're ready to go to the council and argue, please deploy X, Y, Z. Now, I don't mean to wait weeks, but I do think, and again, I'm saying this more generically now because I don't know enough about that crisis. So that's not a judgment on my part about timing. But just, I think that that's another reason that there's a broader conversation about multilateral engagement that we haven't really expressly talked about here, but why it's so valuable. There are regions around those two countries that care deeply about not having it further destabilized. The parties to the conflict are all in the UN. So my hunch, without, again, knowing the details, is there's a lot going on. Whether and how it expresses itself more directly, it's hard to predict, but I'm hopeful for that.
And thank you very much for reminding us that, of course, so much diplomacy goes on behind the scenes. And the very success of it is us not knowing about it until the final outcome. The next question is from Richard Harmston, another member of our planning committee. And he asks, he refers back to Professor Bolden, Jane Bolden's presentation. In panel 2, he said she advocated modifying the principle of impartiality, just so everyone knows what she proposed. Basically, she had been very concerned, and I had mentioned about where the mandate includes stabilization, where it includes, well, one of the ways it's put is reasserting government authority over areas under opposition control. And this has actually involved UN operations where they have engaged, in very robust operations along with the government. She had obviously pointed out the issue of impartiality there, because for the other parties to the conflict, this does not appear like impartial behavior. And so what she had proposed, basically emphasizing that she knew this was not easy, but still feeling that there would be support to the government needed, that if one could fashion the support in terms of support to the institutions of government and to support for, the good governance aspect, as opposed to support for the specific government in question, pointing out how difficult that was. And then also Jean-Marie Guéhenno had brought in the concept of how important then security sector reform would be in the context of ensuring that the government forces, behaved appropriately. So there's a huge amount in there, but anyway, if Tori, if you wanted to take that one on, and then if Peter has a comment.
Well, I'm sorry I didn't join you for that conversation and the nuances that she's flagging. It's an important issue. The UN is not neutral, but impartial, and the distinction is critical. So, for example, most UN mandates for peacekeeping today, you are to uphold your mandate. And so in some senses, they are picking whose side they're on. They're on the side usually of the parties to the peace agreement. And usually, because it's under consent, they're on the side of the government or the nascent government or the process that leads to a government. But the UN has managed this a bit because some host nations are very difficult. And so to the extent that they're impartially upholding their mandate, for example, to protect civilians, that's against any force that would do harm, inclusive of the government's own forces, as we've seen in Congo and South Sudan. So in that balancing act, you can imagine it tipping too far. And South Sudan may be a good case of this, where on one hand, the mission was meant to deploy alongside in support of the peace agreement. the leaders violate the peace agreement, they turn their forces on their own people. And suddenly the mission becomes interpositional between the civilians and government forces. So I guess I'm just explaining why this is important and how they've balanced it. There's also a lot to be said about beyond the high level of consent, looking at human rights and compliance. In Congo, for example, the UN was meant to be doing security sector reform of some of the FARDC, the government forces, but they had to meet certain human rights rules and regulations, and they were not allowed to cooperate with those who have human rights abuses. This is a bit more at the tactical operational level because it's presuming still there's strategic consent from the government and goodwill. But how to measure when the government tips over into going from consent to lack of consent, I think is critical. It's part of our study that I was describing to you. I think we need kind of an early warning system. If the government is no longer seriously showing up for the peace talks, they're not agreeing to the meetings, they're not holding elections, they are abusing people, I think there needs to be a system where the leadership of the mission can signal to New York and to supportive member states in the region and elsewhere, hi, we need help. Because the mission alone can't solve those core political problems. So I'm not sure if I've followed her breadcrumbs, but that's where I will go with that question.
Thank you very much with that, and we're almost out of time, and there are two related UNEPS questions at the very end. So I think that I'm going to just put those together, Peter, and then that'll bring us pretty close to closing time. Doug Roach says, Peter, great presentation. Is there any major government actively favoring a UNEP? Is there any interest by the government of Canada? And then the next question is, my understanding is that Mr. Geheno didn't support a permanent peacekeeping force, but might this short-term emergency force satisfy his objections? I'm going to jump in right now on that he didn't. He is in fact an endorser of the concept, and in fact he clarified that after getting questions in his keynote, which might have raised issues as to whether or not he did support it. His concerns lie in how do we get from here to there. But now I'll turn to Peter with respect to what the government of Canada, do we know what the government of Canada feels about UNEPS and any major government activity actively favoring UNEPS? Peter.
The government of Canada has kept it a good secret if they know much or are inclined to do anything. And it's odd because it's actually really a former Liberal government's first try at pushing the idea. They came up with the concept of a standing emergency group in 1995, submitted it in a report to the General Assembly on its 50th anniversary. Then the report became the background document for a multinational initiative, 28 member states and the Friends of Rapid Deployment. So you would think Foreign Affairs or Global Affairs Canada and the Prime Minister's office might have some inkling or interest, but to date, that, as I said, it's a well-kept secret. Are there other governments? We frequently hear that this is going to be a tough one when it goes toward the P5. It has gone up in the UN previously, and the period that Tori was referring to, 1990 or 2014, 2015, when there were those three big conflicts that created a mini crisis within the Secretariat. I know it went up to the Secretary General's office at that time. But for the P5, I think it's understandable that the Russians and the Chinese and the French should have a shared interest in this. I'm not so sure that the Americans will lead on it, but they have formally, and the ideas moved up in their system as well. So it's not mission impossible, but it's a tough slog, and it has been truthfully a volunteer effort for far too long, and those don't go up as quick as you'd like, especially when you're trying to sort of, what the other commentators suggested, develop first step toward a global peace system. And I think Tori's correct. our adaptation has been very slow. And given the challenges ahead, I think it has to be radically revised in our approach to speed up and catch up, or else. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you both. You know, we've got our work cut out for us. We've got a whole menu of ideas. We've got some very, very good studies that we've been referred to. Roy Culpepper has talked about hoping that Peter's PowerPoint will be uploaded to the group of 78 website, and yes, it will be. And as long and I will be, we will also make available on the website the studies, the two studies, the link for the two studies that Tori Holt talked to us about. And it just remains to me thanking the panelists once again for wonderful presentations and discussion. And to remind everyone that on Monday, October 5th, from 7 to 8:30 p.m., because there will be 3 panelists, it will be contributions by Canada to UN peace operations. So in other words, we'll be looking, it'll be an all-Canadian panel focusing on what Canada can do to help move forward, you know, this very exciting agenda that's been laid out for us. I thank you all very, very much and hope that we'll see you on Monday evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.